The rain hammered against the cathedral windows as James Rivera stood in the doorway, his janitor's uniform soaked through, his calloused hands trembling. Behind him, 300 of the city's most powerful people sat in polished pews, waiting for the funeral to begin. Before him lay an ornate casket worth more than he'd earn in 5 years, surrounded by flowers that cost more than his monthly rent. Everyone thought he'd lost his mind. Security was already moving toward him. But James knew something no one else in that room knew, something that would shatter everything they believed about the man they were about to bury. His heart pounded as he opened his mouth to speak, knowing his next words would either destroy his life or reveal a truth that desperately needed to be told. 48 hours earlier, James had been cleaning the executive offices of Hartman Industries headquarters, just as he did every evening after the corporate staff went home. At 52, with a bad knee and permanent exhaustion etched into his face, James moved through the gleaming corridors like a ghost. Most executives never even noticed him. He was furniture, background, invisible, but James didn't mind being invisible. It meant he could provide for his daughter, Sophie, without drawing attention. At 16, she was his entire world, brilliant, kind, and fighting like hell against the leukemia that had already taken her mother 3 years ago. Every cent James earned went to her care, her medication, the experimental treatments their insurance wouldn't cover. He worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and would have walked through fire if it meant one more day with his girl. That evening, as James emptied the trash in the CEO's office, he'd noticed the light still on in the private bathroom. Strange. The legendary Richard Hartman had left hours ago. James had seen the motorcade depart. He knocked softly. No answer. Probably just forgotten. He pulled out his master key and opened the door. Richard Hartman, billionaire founder of one of the nation's largest pharmaceutical companies, lay collapsed on the floor, his face gray, barely breathing. "Mr. Hartman!" James dropped to his knees, fingers finding a weak pulse. He grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and started CPR the way he'd learned years ago as a volunteer firefighter. Chest compressions, steady rhythm, breathing life into a stranger while the dispatcher's voice guided him. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. By then, Hartman was breathing on his own, conscious but disoriented. As the paramedics loaded him onto the stretcher, his eyes found James. You saved my life," he whispered. "Just doing what anyone would do, sir," James said, but Hartman grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Not anyone. Most people would have run for help and wasted precious time. You knew what to do. You didn't hesitate." He paused, struggling for breath. "What's your name?" "James Rivera, sir." "James Rivera," Hartman repeated like he was committing it to memory. "I won't forget this." The paramedics whisked him away and James returned to his cleaning. His hands were still shaking. He'd saved a man's life. He hadn't thought, hadn't hesitated, had just acted. That had to count for something. The next morning, James was sitting in Sophie's hospital room, holding her hand while she slept, when his supervisor called. "Rivera, you're terminated. Effective immediately." James felt the world tilt. "What? Why?" "Unauthorized access to executive areas. You entered CEO Hartman's private bathroom without permission. Security footage shows you used your master key. That's grounds for immediate dismissal according to your contract, but I was saving his life. He was unconscious." "That's not what the report says. It says you violated privacy protocols. Your final paycheck will be mailed. Don't come back to the building. The line went dead." James sat there, phone in his hand, watching his daughter sleep. Fired. No job meant no insurance, no money for Sophie's treatments, no way to pay for the apartment. Everything was falling apart. He tried calling back, tried reaching human resources, tried everything. But Hartman Industries was a fortress. Nobody would listen to a janitor claiming he'd saved the CEO's life. 2 days later, James saw the news. Richard Hartman had died. Despite the emergency treatment, his heart had been too damaged. The funeral would be held at St. Catherine's Cathedral, the city's grandest church. The governor would attend. So would senators, tech moguls, celebrities. They'd eulogize him as a titan of industry, a philanthropist, a visionary. And nobody would know the truth. James stood in Sophie's hospital room, watching the news coverage, feeling something crack inside him. He'd saved that man's life, given him 2 more days with his family, and been fired for it. Now they were going to bury him with honors while James couldn't even afford his daughter's next round of chemotherapy. Dad. Sophie's weak voice pulled him from his thoughts. What's wrong? He forced a smile. Nothing, honey. Just tired. But she knew him too well. You're thinking about that man again. The one you saved. James had told her everything, hoping maybe it would inspire her, show her that good deeds mattered. Now it just felt like a cruel joke. They're having his funeral today, James said quietly. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad, you should go. What? You should go to his funeral. You gave him time with his family. You should be there. Sophie, I wasn't invited. I'm nobody to them. You're not nobody to me. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. And you weren't nobody to him either. He said he wouldn't forget. Maybe someone needs to remember, which is how James found himself standing in the cathedral doorway 3 hours later, dripping rainwater onto marble floors while security guards approached and 300 important people stared. Sir, you need to leave, the first guard said. Hand on his shoulder. Wait. James's voice cracked, but he pushed forward. I need to say something about Mr. Hartman, about who he really was. Security. Remove this man, someone called from the front pews. But then another voice rang out, clear and commanding. Let him speak. Everyone turned. A woman in her 30s stood from the front row, elegant in black, her eyes red from crying. Elizabeth Hartman, Richard's daughter and new CEO of Hartman Industries. I said let him speak, she repeated, walking down the aisle toward James. You're James Rivera, aren't you? James nodded, confused. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. My father told me about you. In the ambulance, in the hospital, in his last moments. He told me a janitor saved his life. That you didn't hesitate, didn't wait for help, just acted. Because of you, I got 2 more days with my father. 2 more days to tell him I loved him, to hear his voice, to say goodbye. Her voice broke. And then I found out you were fired for saving him. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elizabeth pulled out her phone, projected something onto the screen at the altar. Security footage. James performing CPR, fighting to save a man's life. This is the man our company fired, Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion and anger. This is the man who gave everything while asking nothing. My father's final instructions to me were clear. Find James Rivera. Make it right, because a company that would punish someone for basic human decency isn't worth leading. She turned back to James, and suddenly she was pressing something into his hands. An envelope. My father left this for you. He wrote it in the hospital. James opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter in shaky handwriting. James, by the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. But I needed you to know. You reminded me why I started this company. To help people. To save lives. Somewhere along the way, I let bureaucracy and lawyers and protocols matter more than humanity. You showed me what I'd lost. I'm leaving you 20% of my shares in Hartman Industries, to be held in trust for your daughter's medical care and education. But more than that, I'm leaving you a mission. Help my daughter remember that our company exists to save lives, not just make profits. The board won't like it. They'll fight you. But Elizabeth knows what I wanted. Be the conscience I failed to be. Make them remember that every policy, every decision affects real people. People like you. Thank you for my last 2 days. Use them wisely. Richard. James couldn't breathe. 20%? That was worth. He couldn't even calculate it. Millions, tens of millions. Sophie's treatments, her future, everything. There's more, Elizabeth said softly. We're establishing the Rivera Foundation for emergency medical care for families in crisis. You'll run it if you'll accept. And we're implementing new whistleblower protections and employee advocacy programs. No one will ever again be punished for doing the right thing. The cathedral had gone completely silent. James looked down at the letter, at Richard Hartman's shaky signature, and something inside him broke open. He'd spent years being invisible, being overlooked, being treated as less than. One moment of basic human decency, of simply refusing to walk away when someone needed help, had changed everything. I accept, he whispered. Then louder, I accept, for Sophie, for every family fighting impossible battles, for everyone who needs to know that kindness still matters. Elizabeth embraced him, and suddenly the cathedral erupted in applause. Not polite, scattered clapping, but genuine, thunderous recognition. That evening, James sat in Sophie's hospital room, holding her hand, telling her everything. Her eyes shone with tears and joy and relief. "See, Dad?" she said. "I told you that you weren't nobody." James smiled, thinking of Richard Hartman, of a life saved, of 2 days that had meant everything. "No, sweetheart. None of us are nobody. We just forget sometimes. We all matter. Every single one of us." Outside, the rain had stopped. Through the hospital window, James could see the sun breaking through the clouds, painting the sky gold. Tomorrow, he'd start his new job. Tomorrow, he'd help build something that honored both Richard's memory and every person who'd ever been overlooked. But tonight, he just held his daughter's hand and remembered that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change the world.